at two different types of methodologies of gaining heat for the body. And so one is through endotherms, or these are endothermic animals, and those are ones that use their metabolism to produce heat. And most of those are going to be birds and mammals. And so here you can see the walrus. He's able to live in this particular environment that's very, very cold, not only because he has a whole bunch of fat, but because he has an enormous amount of heat capacity, to metabolic heat capacity. And then you could look at other organisms that don't create a lot of heat, but yet they regulate their heat. And the way they regulate it is through maybe sunning or going under areas that are cooler. And those are going to be ectotherms. And you typically see these in most types of invertebrates, as well as some fish, amphibians, and reptiles. So they have to do it behaviorally. And here's just taking a look at how it can, how this little iguana can kind of heat up. He's going to, when he's cold, he's going to go sit out on the rocks. And if you've ever been to places that have lots of iguanas, or you'll see them, sort of getting warm. It's at early parts of the day, and they'll sit out on the rocks and get radiation and and convection from the rock. And then they might go into crevices during very extreme points of the day to cool down. There's other methodologies of maintaining heat simply by utilizing anatomy. And here you can see, so this is looking at a bird, and here's this nice little Canadian goose, and his legs are really, really exposed, and it's cold. And wherever there's going to be exposure, it's going to lose heat to the environment. So it's going to go from the blood to the environment. So it's a very neat physiological anatomy adaptation that occurs, where we have the arteries, which are nice and warm coming from the body core, and we put them, they've got placed, right next to the veins that are coming up where it's cooler. So all of the heat isn't being lost, through the environment and through other places. The heat can kind of circumvent the whole system, so you're maintaining as much heat as possible. And you could also see this whole artery vein system where they're next to one another to maintain that heat. And here you can just see it in the dolphin over here in the fin there. So it's laid next to one another. We call this whole system countercurrent, meaning when you have flow one way and flow the other way, you're making use of this opposite flow. So this way, we're looking at it, we're making use of it to maintain heat. We're going to look at the function, the anatomy, and the kidney later, and you'll actually see that loop of Henle that's there. The way it's set up allows us to maintain water and salt, and we'll go over that when we go over the function of the kidney. And so there's a number of places where we see this countercurrent exchange. Also, if we look at the gills of fish, and we look at the blood that's running across them, they go countercurrent to one another. So you can pull out as much oxygen as possible from that water that's coming in. So we'll look at, this is a general schematic of anatomy, this countercurrent exchange that we see repeated in different organs and systems to have different functions. All right. So what we're looking at here is we need to maintain some heat. What do we use the food for? Okay. So if we have organic molecules that are coming in, we're going to use the food that we have, obviously, to make different chemicals for anabolic functions, which is producing and making things. And we're also going to break down some of that food so that we can get some ATP. In the process, we produce heat. A lot of it is lost to the system, and a lot of it is going to stay in larger organisms. So what I want to do now is I have a bunch of dice here, okay? And I'm just going to get you guys in groups, okay? And you are going to design a multicellular organism, okay? And I want you to design two. The first one is going to be one that's going to have as much contact with the atmosphere as possible. So it can get a lot of food, it can get a lot of nutrients, maybe like flatworms or things like that. But they are going to have 20 cells in them. And then what I want you to do is I want you to create another organism using the same little dice that's going to actually need to conserve energy. And so would the body plan be different? So we should actually, there we go. Okay, so look at all that exposure that you have. A number of you built some with like sort of the doubles. You went for that flatworm and Nindaria, where you basically had 2 levels, an inside and an outside cavity. So you kind of had some very similar things like that. And so there's lots of exposure. So the good thing is you're getting nutrients, you're getting all sorts of things in the environment. It's passing by. The bad thing is, obviously, you might be losing a lot of heat. So what you guys were really good, everybody kind of made the same kind of deal when we said, okay, how can you build an organism that's going to keep as much heat as possible? You kind of stacked them all up. And I saw all of these kind of stacked up. So there was less surface area around, and you had fewer dice, so I can do it. So therefore, some of these cells that are producing heat on the inside are actually helping the organism, maintain the heat, because it has to stay in the organism. So let's look at a different situation. Let's look at 2 multicellular organisms that are made in this manner, but one is really tiny. Okay, one is very tiny. Let's just make one really, really tiny. And one is really, really big. Okay. So let's take a look at these 2 organisms. Which one of these organisms is going to lose a lot more heat to the environment? The small one, right? It has much more surface to volume ratio than this big one. So if we look at this like this is the mouse, okay, and this is a big elephant. So overall, this mouse is not eating as much energy. It doesn't need as much oxygen as the elephant. The elephant obviously needs more oxygen and food. It's a bigger organism. However, if I then took 1 little gram of the mouse, right, and I took 1 little gram of the elephant, and I compared their metabolic rates, what do you think would happen? What do you think would be the difference between the metabolic rate of a gram of each of these? Remember, this one's losing a lot more to the environment. This one's not. Which one's going to have to eat more? Okay, the mouse. This. So anybody ever look at the way a mouse breathes? A little tiny animal? They're running around, they're always trying to find food. Their metabolic rates are really, really high. How about an elephant? Is it running around going? No, it's lumbering around. So per gram, that elephant has a much lower metabolic rate than the mouse. So let's take a look. Let's go back. Let me go back to your, so let's look at this now. So here is looking at the metabolic rate. So if we look at the overall animals, the little animals of course have a lower metabolic rate. So what is a basal metabolic rate? That means sort of a resting metabolic rate. The reason why we try and keep it basal and resting is because when we're exercising or when we're shivering or something like that, it's going to be different. Ah, thank you. Okay. All right, great. Thank you so much. All right. So it's going to take in, if we look at the overall size, the little mouse is going to eat less, and it's going to also need less food. So basal metabolic rate is resting metabolic rate. So here's the overall metabolic equation that you studied intensely last semester, right? There's respiration. And so there it is. So if you're a little animal, you don't need to eat as much food. However, when we look at it per gram, that's looking at the individual mass. And we did a relationship. Look at these little animals, how much higher their basal metabolic rate is than the larger animals. Okay? And that's simply because they keep losing energy to the environment again and again and again. So in a couple of weeks, we are going to actually be doing this for the class. We're going to be looking at the metabolic rates between different students, okay? We're going to look at the smaller students and the larger students and see what we kind of get. And, you know, we kind of get something typically like this. So there's a number of different ways we could have done this for the lab that we're going to do. We could have looked at, you know, food consumption, but that's difficult to look at. That's difficult to regulate. Oxygen consumption, that would be kind of hard for us to kind of, you know, figure out how much oxygen we do. So then we look at things that you can put off. It would be difficult to tell how much water you're putting in because you're breathing, you're losing it from your skin and other places. Energy, we could do that. We could submerge each of you in a pool in there, but that was kind of difficult. So what we do is we blow into a tube and we blow out your carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide, when it goes into the water, it turns it more acidic, turns into carbonic acid, and so we look at that acid change. So we're actually going to be doing this in lab. Did any of you guys have any questions on this? Does this make sense? Okay, good. All right. So the other thing that we kind of have is when there are extreme conditions, then certain types of organisms go into something called torpor. And a torpor is when you basically reduce your metabolic rate. You might be, it's kind of sleepy. Some of you, if it's a cold torpor, that's hibernating. So some animals go into a hibernation, and here you can see this cute little dormice. He's all cuddled up together, and he's going into hibernation. So a couple of things that are happening now: he doesn't need as much food, he doesn't need to go out and gather in the cold, and he's reduced his metabolic rate while this very extreme cold time is occurring. So torpor is the general name for this decrease of metabolic rate during these extreme times, climactic times. But there's also one for organisms that are experiencing very, very hot or very, very dry times, because that is very difficult for a lot of organisms to deal with as well. So you'll get a number of different types of organisms going into something called estivation. And estivation is basically a torpor when it's really dry or really hot. And so you'll see these, not so much in mammals as much, but you'll see them in, you know, some types of snails. Like if you ever go out and look at a fence when the snails are all kind of climbing on there, a lot of times when it's really dry and stuff, those snails are going into their estivation. They don't like it when it's so dry, and they can actually, or they can close up that opening on the snail, right, so that they lose less heat. And you can wake them up. I mean, it takes a little bit more time, but you can kind of wake them up out of this torpor. So so torpor is the general name for this really big decrease in metabolism. Hibernation is when it happens, when it's cold, and when it's either very, very dry or very, very hot. That's called estivation. Okay. All right. You can also tell a lot about different organisms as to how they use their energy budgets. So here we're going to look at different types of organisms. You have a penguin, a deer mouse, and this python. And you know, they're all eating food, but how are they taking this food? If we go back to this equation, how much of this, the food that they eat, is going to go into, you know, activity and growth and keeping warm and reproducing and things like that, and how much are going to be spent on other activities. So here you see your penguin, and it uses quite a bit to keep that basal metabolic rate going. You know, it's a cold area, but the activity also tries to keep that going. You don't see a lot for some thermoregulation, and you go, wait a minute, that's in a very cold environment. How come they're not going through a lot of this thermoregulation? Well, they use a lot of other principles. They have a lot of other fat underneath, you know, on their body. They have lots of fat that can protect them, and then they also use behavioral adaptation. And then you see that poor little deer mouse. Look at how much of what he eats or she eats that has to go into thermoregulation. So it's a tremendous amount of energy. And then if you look at this python, the python is constantly growing. It's not like other types of organisms that have a growth period and then they kind of stop and then they don't need a lot of energy or have to put a lot in for growth. So they have a lot there. But whereas the python, throughout its life, the older a snake is, the bigger it is, the bigger it is. And so they constantly have to give some energy towards their growth, so a lot of the food that they eat. And so, you know, just to kind of sum up what we talked about today, we looked at that there is this very, very strong relationship between the structure of an organism and the function of an organism, and all these evolutionary advantages that enable these organisms to live, to adapt, and to survive to that environment. So that kind of gives you a big overview of what we were doing. Oops, I wanted to show you these pretty cute little macaws, and this was in your book. So what's happening with them? Anybody remember? What are they doing? So they're hanging out in the hot tub, basically. They're cold, right? This is in a very cold area of Japan. They're hanging out in the hot tub. They're trying to get warm. So these are some also behavioral adaptations that we all have to get warm as well.